My name is Emily Carter, and the moment my boss called me replaceable, I knew my career at that company was already over. He just didn't know it yet. He said it without anger, without hesitation, without even looking at me for long. Emily, he said, tapping his pen against the desk, no one is irreplaceable here. The room was quiet, the air felt thin. And something inside me, something I had carried for years, finally went still. If you've ever been ignored, undervalued, or quietly used at work, stay with this story. Like, subscribe, and comment. I've been there. Because this happens more than people admit. I had been with Northline Solutions for a little over 10 years when Dylan Reeves said those words to me. 10 years doesn't sound dramatic when you say it quickly. But when you live it day after day, deadline after deadline, it becomes a part of who you are. I joined the company when I was 26 years old. Newly divorced. Broke in ways that had nothing to do with money. I remember sitting in my tiny apartment the night before my first day, ironing a blouse that didn't quite fit right, wondering if this job would finally be the stable thing my life had been missing. Northline wasn't a dream job. It was a mid-sized logistics and data management firm based in Ohio. The kind of place most people never hear about unless something goes wrong. But it was steady. It had health insurance. And most importantly, it gave me structure when everything else felt uncertain. My title was Operations Systems Coordinator. Even now, people ask what that actually means. The honest answer? It meant I handled everything that lived between departments, the fragile, invisible connections that kept the company running. I wasn't writing flashy code or closing million-dollar deals. I was making sure the systems talked to each other. That finance could see what operations entered. That reports matched reality. That data didn't vanish into gaps no one wanted to acknowledge. When something broke, I fixed it quietly. When something almost broke, I prevented it often without anyone ever knowing, and that was the problem. In my first few years, my boss at the time, Mark, understood the value of quiet competence. He was old school. He didn't care about buzzwords or presentations. He cared about results. If the system didn't crash, he knew why. If reports were clean, he knew who made them that way. Mark never praised loudly, but he respected deeply. And for a long time, that was enough. I built workflows that weren't in any manual. I created checks that ran automatically at night because I didn't trust daytime processes alone. I memorized patterns, what looked normal, what felt off, what needed attention before it became visible. I stayed late when no one asked me to. I logged in on weekends during quarterly closes. I answered calls on vacations, not because I was trying to be impressive, but because I didn't want things to fail. And they didn't. When Mark retired, the company threw him a small party. Cake, a speech, applause. Then he was gone, and with him went the last person who truly understood how fragile the foundation was. That's when Dylan Reeves arrived. Dylan was in his early 40s, confident in a way that came from never having been the one holding things together. He wore tailored suits, talked fast, and loved saying things like, "We need to modernize our mindset." From the start, he wanted visibility. Open offices, whiteboards, big meetings where people spoke confidently even if they didn't say much. I watched him carefully during those early weeks. He listened more than he spoke at first, but it wasn't the kind of listening that tried to understand. It was the kind that waited for its turn to talk. During my first one-on-one with him, he glanced at my resume and smiled politely. 10 years, he said. That's impressive. There was something about the pause before impressive that didn't feel like a compliment. I explained my role. I kept it simple. I talked about data integrity, system continuity, risk prevention. He nodded, but his eyes drifted to his screen. I like proactive people, he said. But we also need innovation, visibility, ownership. I didn't argue. I never did. As months passed, the tone shifted. Meetings became louder. Decisions were made faster. Consultants were brought in, young professionals with perfect slides and very little understanding of the systems they were analyzing. They asked surface questions. How long does this process take? Why can't this be automated? Can't this role be consolidated? I answered honestly. Carefully. I explained dependencies. I warned about legacy data. I mentioned undocumented connections that existed because the system had evolved, not been designed all at once. Most of the time, my comments were acknowledged with smiles and quickly ignored. Let's not get stuck in the weeds, Dylan would say. The weeds. That's where the roots were. Still, I worked. I always worked. When my annual review came around, I walked into Dylan's office with modest expectations. I didn't need praise. I just wanted acknowledgement that my role mattered. He skimmed my evaluation like it was a formality. You're reliable, he said. Consistent. Reliable. Consistent. Two words that sound positive but feel like a ceiling. I'd like to see more presence, he added. More visibility. I asked what that meant. He shrugged. Speak up more. Lead initiatives. Make your impact seen. I left that meeting with a strange heaviness in my chest. How do you make invisible work visible without breaking the thing you're protecting? Then came the budget talks. Northline had a rough quarter. Revenue dipped. Suddenly, everyone was talking about efficiency. About trimming unnecessary roles. That's when I overheard Dylan one afternoon in the conference room. We have overlap, he said. Some functions could easily be absorbed. I stood outside the room, holding a folder. Frozen in place, that word absorbed followed me home that night. A week later, Dylan called me into his office again. This time he didn't offer me a seat. We're evaluating structure, he said. Preparing for growth. I nodded, already bracing myself. I want to be clear, he continued. No one here is irreplaceable. Systems can be documented. Processes can be learned. That's when he said it. No one is irreplaceable. I looked at him. Calm. Quiet. Of course, I said. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted. I walked back to my desk and sat down slowly. The office hummed around me, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, conversations overlapping. No one noticed anything different. But inside, I had stopped believing that loyalty mattered. That night, I stayed late, not of habit, but out of curiosity. I opened folders I hadn't reviewed in years. Scripts I had written quickly to fix urgent problems. Manual overrides that existed because no one wanted to rebuild fragile systems from scratch. There was nothing sinister there. No secrets. Just complexity. Layer upon layer of quiet decisions made to keep things running. And I realized something that made my stomach tighten. No one else understood it. Not really. I had trained people. I had written documentation. But documentation shows what, not why. And the why was everything. I didn't change a single thing. I didn't sabotage. I didn't hide information. I didn't delete files. I simply stopped doing the things no one knew I did. I stopped checking things twice. I stopped running unofficial backups. I stopped catching errors before they became visible. I did exactly what my job description required. Nothing more. At first, nothing happened. Days passed. Weeks passed. The system still ran. People still assumed everything was fine. That was the illusion. I had built over a decade stability that looked effortless. Then the small things began. A report took longer to generate. A sync failed overnight but corrected itself later. A department complained once about missing data. Each time someone shrugged. Glitch, they said. I kept my head down. 2 months later, Dylan stood in front of the department and announced restructuring. Some roles will be consolidated. He said confidently. My name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. That night, I opened my laptop at home and updated my resume for the first time in 10 years. Not because I was scared, but because I finally understood my worth and how fragile their confidence really was. And somewhere deep inside, I knew they were about to find out what replaceable really meant. I didn't notice the fear right away. That's the strange thing about workplaces like Northline. Fear doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in quietly, disguised as urgency, disguised as just a busy week, disguised as people saying, "We'll fix it later." After Dylan's announcement about consolidation, nothing visibly changed. No one was escorted out. No goodbyes. No layoffs yet. The office returned to its familiar rhythm, and most people assumed the danger had passed. I knew better. I started seeing it in the smallest places first. In the way people hesitated before clicking submit. In the way managers forwarded emails they normally handled themselves. In the way questions that used to come directly to me were now routed through 2 or 3 people, often returning half-answered or misunderstood. It was subtle, but it was there. I continued doing exactly what my role required. Nothing more, nothing less. I came in on time. I left on time. I documented tasks and closed tickets properly. And every day, I felt more invisible. One afternoon, a junior analyst named Kevin stopped by my desk. "Hey, Emily," he said quietly, glancing around like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Do you know why the inventory sync is lagging?" I did know. I had known for weeks. The lag was caused by a workaround I'd implemented years earlier to prevent data loss during peak load. It worked beautifully, but only when someone monitored. That someone had always been me. "It's probably temporary," I said carefully. "You should flag it through the new reporting channel," he frowned. I did. They said it's not critical. I nodded. Then it's not critical. Kevin lingered, uncomfortable. "It feels off." I met his eyes. "Document it." He walked away, unconvinced. 2 days later, finance sent an email about discrepancies in their weekly numbers. Not large enough to cause panic, just enough to cause confusion. Dylan replied to the thread with confidence. "Minor system variance," he wrote. "We're reviewing." I stared at that email longer than I should have. Reviewing required understanding. Understanding required listening. And listening was not something leadership was good at anymore. The consultants were still around, pacing confidently through the office, armed with dashboards and recommendations. One of them, Ashley, approached me during lunch. "You've been here a long time," she said brightly. "We're mapping critical dependencies. Any tips?" I hesitated. There it was, the moment where I could unload everything. Where I could explain the fragile connections, the undocumented logic, the systems that worked only because someone paid attention. But I remembered Dylan's voice. "No one is irreplaceable. Everything important is in the documentation," I said. Ashley smiled. "Perfect." It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Weeks passed. Then came the first real incident. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was already at my desk when operations started buzzing. Emails flew. People stood up, walked faster than usual. A distribution report hadn't generated overnight. This wasn't catastrophic yet. But that report fed into scheduling, forecasting, and client updates. Without it, everything downstream slowed. I watched Dylan pace near the glass offices. "What happened?" he asked loudly. Someone replied, "System delay." Dylan frowned. "Can we regenerate it?" "Trying." They regenerated it. The numbers were wrong, not wildly wrong. Just wrong enough to matter. I knew why. The workaround I had designed years earlier required manual validation when traffic exceeded a certain threshold. That threshold had been crossed. No one had noticed. I stayed silent. Eventually, the issue corrected itself later that afternoon. Dylan sent a reassuring email. "All resolved," he wrote. "No further action needed." I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. That night, I wrote myself a note at home. This is how it starts. The following weeks were worse. Small failures piled up. Individually, they were easy to dismiss. Collectively, they were dangerous. Inventory mismatches. Delayed invoices. Duplicate records appearing in systems that were never designed to handle them. Every issue traced back to the same core problem. The system was no longer being understood. It was being assumed. People began to compensate in clumsy ways. Manual fixes. Temporary patches. Excel sheets where databases should have been. I saw it all. And for the first time in my career, I didn't intervene. Not out of spite, out of exhaustion. One morning, Dylan called an impromptu meeting. "We need faster turnaround," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. There's too much friction. I raised my hand slowly. He looked surprised, like he'd forgotten I existed. Yes, Emily? There's a structural issue, I said evenly. The system's load has changed. Some processes aren't scaling the way they used to. The room went quiet. Dylan tilted his head. Are you saying the system can't handle growth? I'm saying it needs attention, I replied. The architecture assumes active monitoring. He smiled, but there was something tight behind. That's why we hired consultants, he said. To modernize. I nodded and lowered my hand. After the meeting, one of the managers pulled me aside. Was that necessary? She whispered. You kind of put Dylan on the spot. I looked at her. I stated a fact. She sighed. You have to pick your battles. I walked back to my desk wondering when truth had become a battle. At home, I slept poorly. I dreamed about blinking error messages and phones ringing unanswered. I woke up with tension in my jaw, my shoulders tight. I wasn't afraid of losing my job. I was afraid of watching something collapse that I had spent a decade holding together. The first real crack happened at the end of the quarter. It started with a routine update. A minor change that should have taken minutes. Instead, it cascaded. Systems froze. Data stalled. Processes that depended on real-time updates began feeding outdated information. Clients noticed. Emails marked urgent filled inboxes. Dylan's confidence evaporated. Why didn't anyone flag this? He demanded. People looked around. Someone said my name. I felt every eye turn toward me. I stood slowly. This dependency was documented, I said. But it requires manual oversight during peak changes. Dylan frowned. Since when? Since before you arrived. Silence. We assumed it was automated. Someone muttered. I didn't respond. The issue took hours to resolve. Temporary fixes were applied. The system limped back to life, but something fundamental had shifted. People stopped, assuming everything was fine. They started whispering. And for the first time I saw fear in Dylan's eyes, not fear of failure, but fear of exposure. A few days later, HR emailed me. Can you stop by? They asked. I knew that tone. The meeting was polite, careful. We're reviewing roles, the HR rep said. Your position may change. Change how? I asked. She smiled thinly. More documentation. Knowledge transfer. There it was. They wanted my brain without me. I left the office that day feeling strangely calm. That night, I updated my resume again. This time I sent it out. 3 applications, then 5, then 10. I wasn't running, I was preparing, because I could feel it now clearer than ever. The system wasn't failing because I stopped caring. It was failing because no one else ever truly had. And the crash, when it came, would not be quiet. The crash didn't happen all at once. That's something people don't understand about systems, or people for that matter. They imagine failure as a single dramatic moment, alarms blaring, screens flashing red. But real collapse is quieter. It unfolds in layers, each one weakening the structure until the weight becomes unbearable. By the time Northline realized something was truly wrong, the damage had already been done. It started early on a Monday morning. I arrived at the office just before 8, coffee in hand, expecting another tense but manageable week. Instead, I walked into a building that felt different. Too quiet. Too still. People were standing instead of sitting. Phones were pressed to ears. Faces were tight with confusion and stress. I hadn't even reached my desk when Kevin rushed toward me. Double quotes, Emily, he said, breathless. Nothing's updating. What do you mean, nothing? I asked. Inventory, orders, forecasts. Everything's frozen. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not panic. Recognition. I logged in. My screen loaded slowly, then stopped. Data timestamps hadn't changed in hours. Overnight processes had stalled halfway through execution. This wasn't a glitch. This was structural failure. I stood up and looked around. Dylan was already pacing, phone glued to his ear. Fix it. He snapped. At no one in particular. People tried. They restarted services. They ran scripts they barely understood. They applied patches recommended by consultants who had never seen. The system under this level of strain. Each attempt made things worse. Within an hour, client calls started coming in. Orders weren't processing. Shipments weren't syncing. Invoices were missing or duplicated. Revenue didn't just slow, it stalled. At 10:17 a.m. The main operational dashboard went blank. That was the moment everything crossed from problem into crisis. Dylan slammed his hand against a desk. How did this happen? No one answered. Then, slowly, someone said my name. Emily, didn't you used to handle this? Every head turned toward me. I took a breath. I handled monitoring, I said evenly. Preventative checks. Manual. Interventions. Dylan stared at me. Why weren't those in place? They weren't part of the official workflow, I replied. They were safeguards. So you stopped doing them? I didn't flinch. I did my job as defined. The room went silent. For a moment, I thought naively that this would be the moment of understanding. That someone would connect the dots. That leadership would realize the system didn't magically maintain itself. Instead, Dylan straightened. So, you're saying this is because you didn't take initiative. There it was. The shift. The blame. I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not fear. Clarity. I warned you, I said calmly. Multiple times. Dylan scoffed. We all heard concerns. That doesn't excuse letting things fail. I looked around the room, at the managers, the consultants, the people who had dismissed me for months. Not one of them met my eyes. The rest of the day was chaos. Emergency calls. War room meetings. Attempts to rebuild processes that no one fully understood. External vendors were contacted. Costs skyrocketed. By late afternoon, Northline had missed critical deadlines with 3 major clients. That night, I didn't stay late. I went home. And for the first time in years, I slept. The next morning, HR called. Can you come by at 10? They asked. I already knew what it was. The meeting was clinical. 2 HR reps. Dylan. A printed document on the table. We've decided to move forward with restructuring, one of them said. Your role is being eliminated. I nodded. Dylan cleared his throat. This isn't personal, Emily. We just need people who can adapt. I looked at him. You needed people who understood. He didn't respond. They offered a severance package. Minimal. Carefully calculated. Today will be your last day, HR said. We'll need system access terminated by noon. I stood. Of course. As I walked out, something surreal happened. People avoided me. The same coworkers who had relied on me for years suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked relieved that it wasn't them. Kevin caught up to me near the elevators. This isn't fair, he whispered. I smiled softly. It's done. By the time I reached the parking lot, my access was already gone. Northline was on its own. What followed over the next week was astonishing. Without me, nothing improved. In fact, everything worsened. The fixes applied during the crisis were shallow, temporary. They addressed symptoms, not causes. Systems clashed. Data corruption spread quietly. Clients demanded answers. Dylan held meeting after meeting, each one more frantic than the last. They brought in external specialists, expensive ones. Experts who charged by the hour and spoke in careful language. Their verdict was devastating. This system was stabilized by manual oversight, one of them said during a recorded call. You removed the human layer without replacing it. Translation: they removed me. Northline hemorrhaged money. Contracts were paused. One long-term client walked away entirely. And then 3 weeks after my departure, I got the call. It was from Dylan. I stared at my phone for a long moment before answering. Emily, he said, voice tight. We need to talk. I no longer work there. I replied. We're in trouble, he said. The system. We underestimated its complexity. I closed my eyes. What are you asking? I said quietly. There was a pause. We need you back. Temporarily. As a consultant. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, what terms? Another pause. That was when I realized something. Profound. They didn't call me because they respected me. They called me because they had no choice. And for the first time, since Dylan had said the word replaceable, I felt something close to vindication, not the loud, satisfying kind, but the quiet certainty of being right. I'll think about it, I said. When I hung up, my hands were steady. Northline was collapsing, and they finally understood what they had lost. I sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the gray winter sky, my fingers wrapped around a cup of steaming tea. The past month had been surreal. I had been locked out of the systems I had maintained for years, stripped of access, and given a severance package that barely acknowledged the time, energy, and quiet effort I had poured into the company. On the surface, it felt calm, almost normal. But beneath it all, my mind kept replaying every word, every interaction, and every decision that had brought me here. Dylan's words echoed in my head. No one is irreplaceable here. I could still hear the casual way he had said it, as if it were a simple fact, not a knife cutting through the foundation of my years of work. Then the phone rang, and I knew it was him. His voice came through tense, a mixture of urgency and something I didn't expect, an edge of desperation. We need you back. Temporarily. As a consultant, he said. I gripped the phone tighter. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. I already knew what this call meant. They didn't respect me. They hadn't appreciated my work. They had ignored every warning I'd given. And now, when their house of cards was collapsing, they wanted me back, but on their terms. I poured another cup of tea and leaned back, letting the warmth seep into my hands as I thought. I didn't panic. I didn't feel fear. Instead, I felt clarity. I knew what I had to do. Returning as a temporary patch for their mistakes wasn't an option. That would just reinforce the cycle. I fixed the problem, they take the credit, and the next collapse would follow. This time I would return on my terms. I would assert my authority and demand the recognition that had been denied for years. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I meticulously documented every failure, every overlooked dependency, and every manual intervention that had kept the systems running when no one else understood what needed to happen. I cataloged scripts, process notes, operational timelines, and reports. Every invisible effort I had made over the past decade was now visible, undeniable. This wasn't arrogance, it was truth. It was accountability. When I finally walked back into the Northline office, the glass doors reflected a version of me that was calm, confident, and deliberate. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't doubtful. I had prepared. Security smiled politely, unaware that the person they were letting in had quietly held their entire operation together for years. I was led to Dylan's office. He rose immediately, attempting his usual confident posture, but it faltered the instant he met my eyes. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly disheveled. For the first time I saw the strain he had been under, the fragility that had always been invisible to him. Thank you for coming, he said, trying to sound in control. I smiled, polite but firm. I came on one condition. I am not here to patch temporary fixes. I am here to solve this properly or not at all. Dylan hesitated. I'll listen, he said, unsure how to respond. I opened my laptop and began my presentation. No flashy slides. No corporate jargon. I presented the truth, precise and clear. I traced every failure, showed where warnings had been ignored, highlighted the manual oversight that had been my invisible lifeline. Every line of evidence demonstrated that the collapse wasn't random. It was predictable, preventable, and entirely tied to their neglect. I didn't accuse. I didn't exaggerate. The truth was sufficient. Dylan shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to speak, but I continued. I am here to offer 2 options, I said, my voice steady. Option 1. I return full-time, with authority over operations and recognition for my contributions. Option 2. You attempt to fix this without me, and accept that failures, delays, and client losses will continue. Silence filled the room. The HR representative glanced between us nervously. Emily, that's direct, she said finally. I prefer clarity, I replied. Dylan exhaled. Pride and ego had collided with reality. For the first time, he understood what it meant to have dismissed someone essential. By the end of that day, the company agreed to my terms. I returned full-time, but not quietly. I implemented proper monitoring protocols, trained team members thoroughly, and established systems so that no single person, including me, could ever be replaceable again. I insisted on weekly executive briefings, guaranteeing that no decision would ever be made based on assumptions. I demanded formal acknowledgement for my contributions, refusing to allow my work to remain invisible. The impact was immediate. System stability returned. Data flowed accurately. Clients regained confidence. For the first time, I felt the recognition I deserved, not because I demanded praise, but because my value was undeniable. Dylan and the leadership team had learned the hard way. Expertise and dedication cannot be replaced by charm, confidence, or buzzwords. He would never admit it openly, but my presence was no longer something he could take for granted. Beyond the operational improvements, this experience transformed me personally. I understood the importance of asserting my worth, of refusing to let others define my value. Silence and diligence alone are invisible unless paired with strategy, awareness, and advocacy. I began mentoring others, teaching them to document their work, assert their expertise, and claim the recognition they deserved. I became a quiet force in the company, ensuring no one would again feel replaceable, simply because their contributions were behind the scenes. At home, I finally allowed myself to rest. I spent evenings with friends, cooked meals without checking emails, and allowed myself to enjoy life outside work. The peace I'd longed for wasn't granted, it was earned. Reflection brought clarity. Loyalty without recognition is not enough. Quiet competence can be invisible. Empowerment comes from understanding your worth and refusing to let others rewrite it. I realized that the story didn't end with revenge or anger. It ended with empowerment, authority, and recognition. I had survived, not by changing who I was, but by knowing when to assert my worth and demand respect. I had proven to myself and to the people who doubted me that no one is truly replaceable when they understand their value and refuse to let it be diminished. If you've ever been told you're replaceable at work, don't let anyone define your worth. Stand firm, document your contributions, and demand recognition for what you bring to the table. Your skills, dedication, and expertise are not invisible. They are essential. Comment: I know my worth if you've ever been in a similar situation. Like this video if Emily's story inspired you. Subscribe for more real, emotional, empowering workplace stories that show how preparation, knowledge, and courage can change everything.